Young Turks now has audio, the TYT Audio Network, podcasts of some of your favorite shows and new shows, including one with Nina Turner, former Ohio State Senator. She's going to do We the People with Nina Turner, talking about equality and justice and seeing that through the eyes of regular Americans who are affected by politics and policy. Everybody check it out at tyt.com/audio.
Following Donald Trump's summit with Kim Jong Un in Singapore, Iran released a few statements about their feelings on this summit and also warned Kim Jong Un about who Donald Trump really is and how likely he is to pull out of a deal that he has promised to uphold. So let's get to the statements from the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson. He says, "We are not optimistic about these talks. The United States, especially Mr. Trump, has undermined international agreements and has unilaterally withdrawn from them," which is actually true. That is what Trump did with the Iran nuclear deal. He avoided the advice or ignored the advice of his own aides and went forward and decided to pull out of that deal. Now, Iran also responded with the following: "We don't know what type of person the North Korean leader is negotiating with. It's not clear that he would not cancel the agreement before returning home. This man does not represent the American people, and they will surely distance themselves from him at the next elections." I hope that's true, but there are really no promises. Finally, just to give you an idea of Trump's record of pulling out of deals, as well as pulling the United States out of this 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, Trump disowned a joint communique issued by the group of 7 leaders. That just happened, by the way, and it happened hours after he had left their summit to meet with Kim Jong Un. And of course, we all know that he pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. That was the first agreement that he pulled out of in his presidency.
Where are we in life that someone is warning the North Korean leader about the president of the United States?
Right, and I think it's much less about warning Kim Jong Un. I don't think that Iran really cares to warn him. I think what they're trying to do, and I think it's a smart tactic, is make a statement about how Trump just signed an agreement that has very few details. It's incredibly vague, doesn't have a timetable, doesn't have verification, but pulled out of a very comprehensive agreement and deal with Iran. And I'll get to the details of Iran's deal just to remind everyone that there was verification, there was a timetable, there were international leaders who were able to verify through regular checks that Iran was holding up its part of the deal. But with Kim Jong Un and North Korea, that is not the case. At least where we stand right now, there is no timetable, there is no verification.
Iran's making a point that America really can't be trusted anymore with this guy at the helm, and they're probably right. I mean, we've said the very same thing. He's given to reckless decision-making that's not based on anything more than a gut feeling and no knowledge of facts. That's the reason he left the Iran deal, as Anna said, against the advice of his advisors. And so Iran is right, but they're making the point. They're not counseling North Korea, obviously. They're saying, look, America's not to be trusted anymore. In a sense, we're a more honorable nation than America is now.
And remember, not only is Trump pulling out of these deals that would essentially destroy, doing what he's doing is destroying the trust, right? The trust that other countries have toward the United States. Who's to say that, hey, we're gonna sign this deal with the US and then a following president's gonna come in and pull out? That trust can be destroyed within seconds, which Trump has proven, but it's hard to really build that trust. And so he's isolating us from our allies. He's pulling out of deals that we should be upholding just for the main purpose of being trustworthy in this international, in these international issues. But more importantly, I think that what we're seeing with this agreement with North Korea is just incredibly hypocritical behavior by Donald Trump in his leadership, but also by the very base that supports Donald Trump, because they were also the individuals who wanted to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. Why? Because it didn't do enough. Right? We didn't rein in the Iranians enough, except that deal was much more comprehensive and much more detailed. Iran agreed to limit their enrichment processing to 3.7%. In addition, Iran agreed to cap their reserve of low enriched uranium to 660 pounds for 15 years. Iran agreed to redesign the reactor to not create plutonium at such a weapons grade, remaining inoperable. The reactor's fuel that could have potentially produced a bomb would be transported out of Iran, not building additional reactors for 15 years. These were the terms of the Iran nuclear deal, just some of the terms that were verified. They were verifiable. That was written into the agreement. There's none of that with this North Korea agreement. None.
Now, those who are backing Trump right now will tell you, well, maybe we'll get that stuff built in. We know that chances are, and I say this because his own advisors were actually instrumental in scuttling the deal. They couldn't pull all the specifics together for a deal. Maybe they'll pull specifics together, but what Anna's talking about, those specifics we just ran through, those would be terrific to hammer out in a deal like this. There's just no history of being able to work that out.
That's right. Low enriched, more from the Iran nuclear deal, which again, we pulled out of. Low enriched uranium stock is to be reduced by 98%, limiting research and development for 15 years. These measures are to remain in place for 25 years.
That's huge.
I mean, it's huge. And again, it's very specific. And what concerns me is not just the fact that this agreement with North Korea lacks any details and is incredibly vague. What concerns me is that Trump is alienating himself from his own advisors who understand the nuances and the complexities of the situation with North Korea. He is not interested in any advice. And I don't trust him enough to make any deal with North Korea. I don't think he knows what plutonium is. I don't think he knows what uranium is. I mean, these are complicated issues that he doesn't have experience in, which is why he needs his advisors. But as you all know, he has been acting unilaterally for a while now. He feels emboldened to do that, and he is seeking counsel from his own personal friends rather than the individuals who surround him in the White House.
Yeah, it is lunacy, and that was a great summary of where we are. I think at the end of this all, Trump says, look, make a deal with North Korea, make it. And they make some kind of cobbled together deal that likely won't be verifiable. Obviously, we didn't expect an agreement, as we said, or a deal, a real formal deal after that little photo op and lunch. But I don't see anything more than a surface kind of agreement cobbled together simply because Trump is impatient and he wants the headlines.
Yeah, and by the way, at the time that the nuclear deal was signed with Iran, Obama was quoted as saying the following: "The nuclear deal is not built on trust, it is built on verification." And what we have heard from Trump in regard to North Korea over and over again is, I trust them, I have a gut feeling, I can read them, it's about attitude. No, that means nothing in the international, in international issues. That means absolutely nothing when dealing with adversaries. It means everything to have verification and a process in which you can prove that they're holding up their side of the deal.
Even the deal made with Russia, the old Soviet Union, Reagan's line was trust but verify. So he was ready to say, look, I trust them, but verification is also very important. So clearly, verification is the key part of any future deal. I just, as I say, don't know, because Trump's in such a hurry to get the headline, to proclaim an agreement, to pick up his Nobel Peace Prize. I just don't know that there is urgency on his part about making deals that actually have verification at their core.
2 easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below. Then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell. And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.